Welcome, and thank you for listening in on our latest Economic Outlook report as we focus in on the number of new COVID-19 cases, a look at how stimulus impacts incomes, and what it all means for the summer outlook. This conversation is taking place on Monday, June 1st, 2020. Leading today's update is Prevedere's Chief Economist, Andrew Duguay. Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chrissy, and looking forward to our brief time here with a little bit of an update in a couple areas that we think are particularly interesting as you start to think about the future and how we're transitioning to call this a second phase, right? We went through the lockdown, now businesses are starting to reopen, and it's really about the recovery, the pace of recovery, how fast we can get back to work, and how all these pieces are going to fit together in this unprecedented disruption that we've had from the health crisis and the economic crisis that has subsequently happened. So today I want to start off by giving us an update on the total number of new confirmed COVID-19 cases. I think the last time we talked and we showed this slide, there was some optimism that perhaps we had reached a total peak in the world number of new cases. And then over the past couple weeks, what we have seen is that there has been another ramp up. This really comes from emerging markets, where we've seen the number of new cases increase in places like Brazil and India. The US is actually still very much contributing towards the total number of new cases. As you can see that the United States line in blue on this chart, we're really no better off than we were just a few weeks ago in total number of new cases daily. We would like to see, obviously, this line decrease and decrease faster, because that would mean that we are bending the curve and we're bending it downwards rather than just bending it sideways. This becomes much more interesting as businesses start to open up. This poses new threats, obviously, for people to relax their social distancing. And while the economy, I think, desperately needs businesses to open up and for people to get back to some form of normal in terms of their activity, we have to be cautious of the fact that we could be creating a second wave of cases, or the fact that when we look at the total number of cases, we're really no safer off we are today than a few months ago, even though some of the restrictive measures have been relaxed. So new cases do remain at elevated levels. The reopening of businesses pose new threats, and the levels have not decreased very much. And so these do give us a pause and a reminder that while we still are sticking to our projection of a U-shaped recovery, which is still a very broad projection, but the fact that second half will be better than the first half of the year, and that we'll see that slow recovery extended to 2021, there's still a great amount of downside risk. We have not cured COVID-19, and the number of cases still remains at very elevated levels. So as long as those two facts remain, there's still a very high threat of the economic outlook being adjusted and adjusted downward due to these facts, essentially. So outside of the United States, when we look at the total number of new cases, I did want to point out Brazil and India. They are not over the curve, right? They have not decreased their cases. In fact, increases in cases at a very rapid rate are causing the total world count to increase over the last few weeks. The Brazil data is very choppy. We do know that as this shifts from Asia, where there is in most countries very good amount of testing, to Europe and then the United States, where testing was slow at first, but has increased rapidly due to the manufacturing capacity and the adaptation in the United States to get new tests available. Now that the COVID-19 is shifting towards emerging markets, we have to realize that their resources are not as strong, and so testing is going to be weaker. And so that poses two risks. So one is that the economy doesn't, the people don't realize how big the threat is of COVID-19, and so people might not restrict their movement soon enough when there's outbreaks because of the lack of testing. And two, the ability to just ramp up testing and get it out to people and then the hospital facilities is just a much more difficult task than it is in developed developed nations. So as the coronavirus pandemic shifts its peak towards emerging markets, we're going to see, I think, more uncertainty in the data, but still it seems like very alarming levels coming out. So we will keep an eye on that. Obviously damaging to the local economies, but still a cause to suggest that there should be caution all around the world, because we are not through this by any means. It's just shifting countries, and if we are, if you're listening today from the United States, you might be, mentally trying to think past coronavirus, but just realize that some parts of the world are still really in the middle of it, in the heat of the crisis. So we've looked at coronavirus cases, and we're going to talk about the elevated risk. I want to shift gears here and follow up a little bit on our last conversation where we were talking about stimulus and the impacts of that. And so we've had some new data come out for April about the stimulus measures and their impacts on income. And so I wanted to show you a couple data sets here that were interesting. I think this might put in perspective why some businesses might be feeling coronavirus hard, but others might have been surprised by the lack of decline in business given everything that they're reading about in the newspapers. We've seen a lot of retailers post pretty solid numbers. And I think it's because in the United States, we haven't gone through something of this scale. Not only a health crisis, but also the government response of a scale. And so to put that scale in perspective, here's a look at government social benefits transfers. And so this means unemployment payments plus any sort of stimulus payments that the government pays out. And you can see the most recent data point there is April. And looking at history, this obviously it's unprecedentedly high, but to compare this to the last time we had a stimulus was, back in 2008. That's that little blip that's in the middle of the chart there, and that was the American Recovery Act, right? And at that time, the payments ranged around $600 a person or $1,200 for a household. Well, we've doubled those numbers with those one-time payments to in the CARES Act. So in less than 10 years, the stimulus measure was much more generous this time, right? Doubling what we saw in 2008. And then on top of that, you have to consider the fact that there's that $600 extra weekly unemployment that the federal government is kicking into state unemployment levels. And we've talked about that a little bit in the past, but that just means a very substantial government transfer that we haven't seen anything like it in the past. And so what this has done is it has boosted real incomes across the United States. When you look at measures of incomes, yes, there have been a lot of jobs that have been lost, but we know from the extra unemployment that the median wage has been replaced. That's why they came up with that $600, because they looked at the gap between average wages being paid out and what states were contributing to unemployment and decided to fill that gap for the average worker. That's how they came up with that $600 a week. That plus the generous $1,200 to $2,400 in one-time payments means that we've seen an unprecedented boost in incomes. So I took a couple different versions here of incomes. I pulled it from our Prevedere application. I'm looking at, in green, the real personal income, and then in the blue, real disposable personal income. And so for you non-economists out there, the difference between that is taxes, right? So disposable personal income says after taxes, this is the amount of income I've done. So real personal income got a big boost in April and actually went up to the tune of around 11% on a year-over-year basis. And that's what we're showing here in this chart on a year-over-year. But then if you take into the fact that the stimulus checks, the $1,200, $2,400 are tax-free, plus the fact that some employer taxes have had tax breaks, and so therefore if someone's self-employed, they might be getting a break from some of the taxes that they would normally pay on the employer side of the FICA taxes. What we see is that real disposable personal income has gone up even more. So this totals to over a $2 trillion boost in total disposable income versus last year alone, and a substantial increase on a year-over-year basis. And then when we look at the extra boost that you get from the fact that the stimulus, isn't taxed, or that there's been some employer tax breaks that benefit individuals who are self-employed, that's an extra around 300-400 billion in the gap, and that's the difference between the rise in that green line and the rise in the blue line. So you can see from this chart that this was much more of a stronger impact. You could see that in 2008, 2009, those stimulus checks really only helped compensate for some decline in income and only got them really back to 2006 levels. So really just almost a blip on the chart when you saw the stimulus. Not so this time. We did see a decline in March, but the rise in April when the stimulus came in was much more substantial, and we haven't seen anything like this before. And this is why it's been so difficult to forecast industry by industry, category by category, is because many who have been able to stay open and have a product that people might want in a social distancing manner, people have the money to spend, at least right now. And so we see that these boosts, if you look all the way back to history, nice data history back to the 1960s, we haven't seen a kind of this substantial of an increase, boost in incomes on a year-over-year basis ever. So what does this mean? This means that the stimulus has been very aggressive by historic standards here in the U.S. Now, that obviously the $1,200 and $2,400 payments are one-time payments, and so that's not going to show up again and again in May and June and July unless there happens to be new stimulus that's passed. The other part of that stimulus is that $600 a week in unemployment benefits, which we know for half of Americans that will replace, plus this, along with the state unemployment, will replace as much, if not more, of the income from the job that they lost. So I think what we're seeing is that there's this delayed effect in it, and I'm starting to count down the days to the end of July. For the fact is that so we have this one-time stimulus, so we're not going to see the $1,200 check again unless they pass a new government stimulus package, which could happen. But the $600 a week does expire at the end of July, and we have about 30 to 40 million jobs to replace and get people back to work. Otherwise, they're going to be negatively impacted when that $600 goes away. Or Congress is going to have to pass another stimulus measure. So what we're seeing is that I think through the May numbers, June and July, we're probably going to see that things might feel okay depending on what industry you're in, because generally incomes have been replaced, and they've been replaced plus some. Now, a lot of that is going to savings. And so when you look at total spending numbers, yes, they're down in March, they're down in April, and that's the gap, is that people are saving more, and they're saving a lot of that money that comes in. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? And that puts people in a better financial position heading into the second half of the year. However, we do need to realize that there could be delayed effects here, right? Is if some of the stimulus is very aggressive and has people's incomes well above what they were earning, to the tune of an unprecedented jump from last year. There is going to be another side to this when that stimulus runs out, or we try to transition people back into the workforce. And so I think as we move through the summer, we've talked about a summer of cautious optimism, because there's a lot of changing pieces here that are going to need to go very well for people to get back to work and be reemployed and be able to adapt to the new economy. It's nice to see that businesses are reopening, and hopefully what social distancing measures that are still encouraged do get those cases to come down. But emphasis on cautious here, because what we've seen is that the number of cases in the US has almost flatlined over the last few weeks, right? It's oscillating around a level and isn't necessarily dipping lower. And if that continues, we might be in a position where we have to have further restrictions, or things that we're going to reopen, we might have to pull back on. And this could be very dangerous when we look at the second half of the year, right? When the weather starts to turn colder, there could be more implications there with this matched with flu season. So there are still a lot of health crisis impacts that are going to be combined with our man-made impacts and problems, such as stimulus running out, right? And what happens after July 31st when those $600 payment a week payments expire. So we will be continuing to monitor these, and so our expectation and our outlook is for a slow recovery. It's to extend it to 2021. I don't think we're really changing or revising that, but I would just emphasize there's still a wide range of outcomes. As we get more comfortable in this new world, it might be easy to sit back and start to think that the range of possibilities has narrowed a bit, and I think they're still pretty wide, at least very wide by historic standards, in the number of outcomes that could happen. So we still have a most probable outcome, and that's the one we'll continue to share with you. But I think what the numbers that we've seen the last few days from the number of new cases shows us that there's still a high range of outcomes to be expected. So in the near term, I think that boost to personal incomes, I think, is benefiting a lot of businesses and also individuals, but we know that that's not going to last, and there's going to be some probably painful transitions to come in the future days. So we will continue to keep an eye on that. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chrissy. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew. As always, we appreciate your perspective and value your insights. For anyone listening today on the call, if you have any questions for Andrew, please use the contact information on the screen. And that concludes today's economic update. Stay tuned for follow-up presentations, and thank you again for joining us.